So we understand speciation. We have a common ancestor diverging into multiple species. Typically one common ancestor diverging into two species. So how can we map or how can we demonstrate those relationships? Yes, we can talk about it. There's a common ancestor to grizzly bears and polar bears. But what if I want to show the evolutionary history of multiple species? Well, we've got a tool for that. And that tool is called phylogenetic trees. And you've probably seen these before, even if you've never distinctly worked with them. And so what a phylogenetic tree is, it's a hypothesis. It's a guess, but a strong guess, a guess rooted into scientific understanding of how we know it right now. And what this hypothesis is it is arranging these evolutionary relationships between organisms. Now, this is a whole field of science all by itself. This is a field called systematics, and kind of like the name implies, it's systematically organizing all these different organisms that exist. We can use phylogenetic trees looking at literally every living organism. That's what this phylogenetic tree on the right-hand side is looking at. Or we can look at just a subset of species and look at the interactions between those species. Now, looking at these two diagrams, you might notice that these are shaped very differently. So here we have this more blocky type shape. Here we're using more just kind of linear relationships. They can show us the same thing. On the subsequent slides, I'm going to tell you how to read these type of phylogenetic trees, but it's the same whether it's a blocky style or a line-based style. The relationships are still similar. Now, before I talk about how to interpret it, I just kind of want to give some props to the very first ever phylogenetic tree ever. And I think it's really powerful. The page starts, I think, and then we have this very primitive, very early on phylogenetic tree of the relationships between species A, B, C, and D. And this one representing a common ancestor to all of these organisms. And this handwriting is horrible, but something between A and B, something, C and B, first radiation, B and D. There's a bunch of words. This is what happens when scientists write, is that you just don't understand what they're saying. But anyway, this very first phylogenetic tree, this notebook that we have in display in museums is from none other than Charles Darwin. So not only was he kind of coined the father of natural selection, but he also kind of started the field of systematics unbeknownst to him. He was really the first one to use this tool as a way to explain evolutionary relationships between organisms. So shout out Charles Darwin. So what I'd like you to do in your notes is I actually want you to draw what you see on this slide. Ignore the colors and ignore the text for now. We're going to kind of fill those in together. So we have this one line that's a backbone, and then we have species A, B, and C. So go ahead and just roughly outline that in your notes. Now, before I touch on anything that this chart is showing us, I want to kind of put this phylogenetic tree in terms that we've already been talking about. So I'm going to use a different color, hopefully a color that we don't really have. We'll use red. Yeah, that's fine. So here in this bottom corner where there's no letter next to it, there's no name next to it, this is representing the root of the tree. And the root of your phylogenetic tree is the common ancestor to all the species that are on your phylogenetic tree. Species A, B, and C all can trace their lineage back to this guy right here. So that circle is representing, here's a common ancestor. Here is species D. And species D was the common ancestor to these A, B, and C species. Now remember, early in this class, I showed you this diagram of a single line diverging into two lines. Here's the common ancestor. We diverge into species A and species B. That's exactly what a phylogenetic tree is. It's just multiples of those. So if we look here, here's the common ancestor that diverges in one direction and in another direction. You have been drawing this diagram already. But now we're just going to add more branches to it. So that single line coming in is representing a common ancestor. And in this case, it's the common ancestor to A, B, and C. There's a speciation event. There's divergence happening where that's part of that population is undergoing natural selection, is evolving to present-day species A, and then the other one continues on. The other one diverges again. It has another event. Now this line right here, I'm just going to put a box around it. This line right here represents a common ancestor, right? We have a single line that's going to diverge into species B and species C. Now this common ancestor is a common ancestor to species B and C. Just species B and C. Species A is in the past. Species A has diverged. Species A has evolved. It's undergone natural selection. It's living its best life. But this common ancestor is just for B and C. So while we can use the term common ancestor to refer to the common ancestor of the entire tree, there's some other common ancestors in here as well. This common ancestor of B and C may look quite different than what the common ancestor is for all of them. But no, it's still a common ancestor. It's one species that then diverges into two species. So the way that we can note this, so if you look here, they have a circle around this node and they call it a speciation event. That's essentially us saying like, hey, there's divergence happening and this is where we see a split with one species and another species. This is also a way you can trace how many common ancestors there are. So technically, I'm going to use yellow, but I kind of already know it's not going to show up awesome. I'll try using light green. It's also a different way to denote how many common ancestors are being represented. So for example, I've already told you that this line represents a common ancestor. One line, one common ancestor, hits a speciation event and then diverges. And then another common ancestor is being denoted by this line. We have one line that then diverges into species B and species C. So it's the second common ancestor. So if I were to ask you how many common ancestors are being depicted on this phylogenetic tree, the answer is 2. Now, that's quite simple for this one, right? You're just counting 2 lines. But honestly, you're going to get the same answer counting something different. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to erase just all of this so that you guys aren't getting confused at all. So another way to count how many common ancestors there are is counting how many speciation events or how many nodes there are. Count every intersection. And this should make sense to you because if we were to take this diagram, this very simple one, the intersection shows all the organisms, right? The intersection shows the common ancestor coming in and species A and species B going out. So the intersections also tell you how many common ancestors there are. So while yes, you can be technical and be like, well, I am going to count all of the lines that lead to a species A and species B, you totally can. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to give you a phylogenetic tree that has 16 different species. Counting the nodes is going to be a lot easier than counting the individual lines. The answer is the same no matter what, but nodes just easier to count. All right, so that kind of explains the common ancestry, the speciation events. Let's talk about how they're talking about this unique history of A and B and C. And so to do that, we're going to go back to red. These lines, it's almost like a logic puzzle. They're going to give you a clue of the organisms following that line. So here we have a common ancestor down here. And this is very generic, species A, B, and C, but I'm just going to write fly, the trait of being able to fly. Now, let's trace evolutionary history. We have a common ancestor that starts down here. So it's before the word fly. So we're going to say, okay, that common ancestor didn't fly, because common ancestor is found below this term fly. All right, we diverge. We go to species A. Species A also is downstream, so to speak, of flying. It can't fly either. But if we start going into B and C, this common ancestor did develop the ability to fly. And we're going to assume that species B and C can also fly because there's no other pieces of evidence that suggest they don't. And so we can write traits on these lines. You can write traits on the ancestral line. You could also write traits here. So maybe this is, of course, I'm going to choose a really long thing, pointy ears. Pointy ears is only on the B line, meaning it is only B that has that trait. C doesn't have that trait. A doesn't have that trait. None of the ancestors have those traits. So where these traits go are going to give you clues as to where that trait developed and which species hold those traits. And don't worry, we're going to do tons of examples of this, but this is just a very generic, here's just how to briefly interpret a phylogenetic tree. Now, something you may have heard me talking about were traits. And on a phylogenetic tree, we can classify our traits into two distinct categories. Ancestral traits, and these traits are the traits that the common ancestor of the entire tree had. So this is the common ancestor of A, B, and C. So that very first common ancestor, the root of our tree, the ancestral traits are the traits that describe that ancestor. Then we have derived traits. Derived traits are the ones that appear or happen as our species are developing. These are changes from the common ancestor. The common ancestor was one thing, but these other species acquired these traits during their evolutionary history. So let me give you an example. So here, kind of a generic species A, B, C, D, and E. And here there are 3 traits listed. We got fuzzy tail, we got big ears, and we got whiskers. So I might ask you a question. What are the derived traits? What traits are different than our common ancestor? And very simply, and you can write this in your notes, very simply, derived traits are going to be the traits listed on the tree. Plain and simple. The ones listed on the tree, those are your derived traits. So in this case, fuzzy tail, big ears, and whiskers are things that are derived, these things that changed in evolutionary history. Now, ancestral traits are very rarely written on phylogenetic trees. Sometimes they are, but it's pretty rare. There's very rarely going to be traits listed along here. These are implied. Okay, well, if we gained a fuzzy tail, that means the common ancestor had an unfuzzy tail, had a maybe scaly tail. Okay, if we got big ears, then we're going to imply that our common ancestor had small ears. If we derived whiskers, then our assumption is the ancestral trait is without whiskers. So derived traits are going to be what's listed on our phylogenetic tree. Our ancestral traits, sometimes they are, but for the most part, they're assumed by essentially implying the opposite of what we've derived. Now, there's some exceptions to that, and I'm going to use whales as an example. So everything listed in this phylogenetic tree, you might recognize the name of some of these. These are all mammals, and one of the characteristics of mammals is fur. Now, I'm telling you that the root of this tree, the common ancestor of this tree, I'm going to tell you is a reptile. And so we're using reptiles, and we're talking about how do species diverge from reptiles to mammals. Now, we know that mammals have fur. Mammals derived fur. And so what I'm going to write is fur. And I'm writing it pretty early on. We know that this is representing the reptile ancestor. We know the reptile ancestor didn't have fur, which is why I have this term fur like pretty high up there. So we had the reptile ancestor, and then through divergence and through natural selection is developing fur, and the rest of this tree has fur. But whales don't have fur. So I'm actually going to do loss of fur. They're still mammals. They still have mammary glands. That's why they are still considered mammals, but they lost their fur. Now here, derived traits. It's really easy to get caught up in thinking derived means gaining something. So here you might be like, oh, fur's on the tree. We derived that. We gained fur. Derived trait. You're right. But the loss of fur is also written on the tree. The loss of fur is a derived trait. So derived traits don't necessarily mean something has been gained. It can mean something has been lost as well. It means a change. That's the biggest thing, is it means a change. So there's actually two changes in this tree. Fur was gained and fur was lost. So in this case, both of those are listed as derived. Ancestral trait. There is only one common ancestor to this tree. So I'm going to tell you right now that common ancestral trait is not gains fur and loses fur. It is one or the other. And this is where you almost kind of do a logic puzzle. And what this logic puzzle is what you're looking at is, okay, well, it was really late in evolutionary history that we lost fur, and all through here we had fur up until this point, and so right before this point, they must not have had fur, right? You can't get fur unless you just didn't already have it. So you're almost back calculating, okay, look at the traits closest to the common ancestor. If we gained fur, okay, that must have mean we didn't have fur to begin with. So just pay attention to that. You're going to see examples of this. We're going to practice with examples of this. Derived traits written on the tree, ancestral traits you have to figure out based on when the derived traits happen. So the last thing that we're going to do when talking about phylogenetic trees is just how we draw them. We're going to use simplistic phylogenetic trees just so that you kind of get the idea of what they are. But know that these can become very complicated. And this field in general is a really large and exploding field. Scientists in the past used to make phylogenetic trees based on physical characteristics. We still largely do, but with the emergence of molecular data, we're actually relying more and more on proteins and the amino acid sequences and the DNA sequences to create more molecular-based phylogenetic trees. So, moral of the story, phylogenetic trees get very complicated very quickly. We are just keeping it kind of simplistic, but the same concept is still there. One last term that I haven't introduced yet is this idea of an outgroup. So the very first thing that says here, the lamprey is the outgroup. And essentially what an outgroup is, not every phylogenetic tree has one, but the outgroup is just the organism that is purposely put on the tree to help root the tree. I'm going to go back to this previous example. I used reptile as an outgroup, and everything else was a mammal. So you have one reptile and then all these other mammals. It's like, okay, why is it so different? Well, it helps you to get a starting point. It helps you to kind of realize what I wanted to focus on when it came to evolution. In this case, I was focusing on the evolution of mammals, the gaining of that fur. So I used reptiles as a way to root where I wanted to start my story. I could have put mammalian ancestor on my tree. But if I did that, it's not really an outgroup, and it's not showing me mammalian evolution. Not every phylogenetic tree has an outgroup. It depends on what you're trying to show. Just know if you see something saying, hey, something's the outgroup, you automatically know that's going to be the most different organism than everything else. So again, not every tree has them, but if you see an outgroup listed, it's the one that's most different from everything else. And this problem tells us, hey, the lamprey is the outgroup. And so then it asks, what traits are derived? Now, typically the outgroup is most similar to the common ancestor. And if we look for these 5 features, we got lungs, jaws, feathers, gizzard, and fur. Lamprey has zeros all across the board, meaning they do not have these traits. And if you see we got pluses on a lot of these other organisms, this means they gained those traits. So for what traits are derived, this one's pretty straightforward. Well, the lamprey, which is pretty much our common ancestor, or the most related to our common ancestor, didn't have lungs, but then we did. They didn't have jaws, and then we did. They didn't have feathers, and then they did. So in this case, lungs, jaws, feathers, gizzards, and fur, these are all going to be derived traits. Our outgroup didn't have these, and then the rest of them at some point gained those traits. So how do we go from a table of characteristics like you see here to one of those designs of our phylogenetic tree? So this is the same table, I just kind of made it a little bit smaller and put it to the side so we can use it for reference. First things first, start with your outgroup. And so that's what I have here. So I've got our common ancestor down here. This little line is representing the common ancestor of everything. I've got one species going in one direction, which is our lamprey. I know it's the outgroup. I know it's first. This is also the one that lacks any kind of characteristic. And then I know all the rest of those organisms are going to come later. Now, what you do next is up to you. And everyone does it a little bit differently. So I'm going to kind of show you both ways. Cool, you got the outgroup. You got the easy one. Now the question is, what comes next? So you can do one of two things. The first thing you can do, this is the way I do it. You don't have to do it that way, but it's the way I do it, is look at the next trait that would have evolved. And the reason you know this one evolved next is that most organisms have it. You know the lamprey won't have it, but you know everything else will. So I look in this table, and essentially what I'm looking for is what has the most pluses. So lungs, it's got 3. Jaws, it's got 4. That's looking good. Feathers 1, gizzard 2, and fur 1. Well, every single other organism other than lampreys have jaws. That's probably going to tell me that jaws is the trait that comes next. Jaws was derived in this evolutionary history. And so you can see they've already written jaws on here coming after the lamprey. Remember, the lamprey doesn't have it, so it's coming after the lamprey. Another thing you can do, you can even think of it as the next step, is instead of looking at the trait, you can look at the organism. So find the organism that is most similar to our outgroup. So lampreys have 5 zeros, antelopes 2 zeros, eagle 1, alligator 2, sea bass 4. All right, sea bass and lamprey are pretty much exactly the same except jaws. So I can also, it's going to be on the next slide, I could draw another line here and be like, okay, this has got to be sea bass. They've got to be the next ones. They're nearly the same as lampreys. Now you notice the style that's being drawn here is kind of this V shape. Totally fine. I could also draw it if you're like, I like the boxy shapes. We can also do that. So here's lamprey. And then that. And then all the other species come. This is showing the same exact thing. This is not different. So here's our sea bass. If I look in this table again, I'm going to find, oh, well, lungs is found in 3 species. Feathers only 1, gizzard 2, fur 1, so lungs must have come next. And if lungs came next, well, it looks like it looks like our antelope would have come next because that had 2 zeros. So we get the development of lungs, and then we go to antelope. And then looking at the next trait, gizzard, that's shared by 2 organisms, so the gizzard's probably the next trait. And then that leaves us with the alligator and the bald eagle here at the end. Now, there was 2 traits missing. I'll go back to this slide and I'll fast forward. So I've got jaws, lungs, and gizzard all listed on here, but there's 5 traits. Sure, my organisms are already listed, but not all my traits are listed, and you need to list all your traits. So now the antelope has fur that hasn't been put on here, and the bald eagle has feathers that hasn't been put on here. We can still put them on here, but instead they go onto individual lines. Antelope were the only organisms with fur. Bald eagle were the only ones with feathers. I also want to show you that these diagrams have tons of different ways you can drawing it. So for example, I'm going to kind of simplify this. We're going to say here's our lamprey. I'm going to do S for sea bass. Something that would have been the exact same. So if I did alligator, bald eagle, and antelope. If I had drawn it like you see here on the right, this is actually the same exact tree as the one that's more professionally drawn. The one that's more professionally drawn is the one that you more than likely would have drawn, but I just want you to know that these are interchangeable. Alligator and bald eagle, as long as you have feathers on the right line, those spin, right? We have a common ancestor that diverges into bald eagle and alligator. It does not matter who's on the left and who is on the right. This common ancestor that had lungs diverged into antelope and then to the common ancestor bald eagle and alligator. Well, over here, here's that common ancestor diverged into antelope and then alligator and bald eagle. So just know that these can kind of be mirrored in quite a few ways. More than likely you're not going to run into that, but if you do, just know that it is the same. Think about the common ancestor and what it turned into. Again, if I wanted to draw this using a boxy style, so here's our lamprey, I think the boxy, in my opinion, the boxy style is a little bit harder, which is why I don't really use it. Here's the sea bass. Here's the antelope. And I just suck at it myself. Yeah, I totally made this not as pretty as it should have been. Bald eagle and alligator. You kind of get the drift. Hopefully you get the drift. But it's showing the same types of relationships. Just, it's harder to draw, in my opinion, it's harder to draw that style than the more V style. The very last thing that I have for you is thinking about in general, these are hypotheses, right? And there's literally an infinite number of ways to draw these trees. Yes, I showed you that they can mirror back and forth and they say the same thing, but I mean in general, we can draw these trees differently. So here's the same organisms and the same traits. And what we have here is here's the common ancestor to the tree, and one branch goes to both sea bass and lamprey, and the other branch goes to the other organisms. Whereas before we had one branch to just the sea lamprey, and another branch to everything else. But this one groups them differently. And when it groups them differently, we still need to show the traits. So for the sea bass, we put jaws on there because they have jaws. Lampreys don't. And then we wrote jaws again, antelope, bald eagle, and alligator. Like, they have jaws. But we now have added an extra step. In our first tree, we wrote jaws once. It evolved once. Lungs evolved once. The gizzard evolved once. This tree says, hey, jaws evolved twice. Well, we've talked about statistics and evolution, that most likely the simplest solution to an answer is probably what actually happened in evolutionary history. And this idea, at least when it comes to phylogenetic trees, is called maximum parsimony. This essentially means, hey, whatever's most parsimonious, meaning the most simplest, is probably true. So yes, you could draw this phylogenetic tree, but it's likely not what happened in nature. Jaws likely didn't evolve twice, especially because we can demonstrate this, and jaws only evolved once. So that's what I mean by parsimony. You want the most parsimonious tree, aka the fewest steps. If you're trying to figure out, like, does this have more or less steps than something else, count the number of labels. This has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 labels. This tree has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, 5 labels is less than 6 labels, so the 5 labeled tree is the most parsimonious tree. And this again, just kind of comparing them side by side. Yes, they say the same information, but they show different evolutionary relationships. So again, that was kind of a brief overview of phylogenetic trees. We're going to be doing a lot of examples of these in class. You're going to see tons of these trees just in scientific literature. It is a growing field at the moment. And it's really just important to be able to not only talk about evolutionary relationships, but to also diagram these evolutionary relationships, because it can give you a lot of information as to what has happened in our evolutionary past.